I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. Okay, welcome everybody back to I Mix What I Like right here at I Mix What I Like. I'm Jared Ball, got Geechee Yaw, and our special guest this afternoon, Dr. Butch Ware, who, among many other things, is a professor in the Department of History at UC Santa Barbara with trained in African history, African American history, and Islamic intellectual history, whose research spans the last 1,000 years, centering on West Africa while reaching into the Mediterranean lands of Islam and the Atlantic worlds and the Africa diaspora. Dr. Ware, welcome. Good to speak with you. See you again.
It's good to see y'all brothers again. And I have to say, man, I'm excited because nobody asked me to talk about my academic work anymore. And I mean, seriously, everybody just wants to talk politics. And when we get into the teeth of talking about the work, I mean, for me, there's a direct relationship between the kind of political intervention I'm trying to make and the academic interventions I've been trying to make for my whole career. So, like it's organically connected in my heart and in my head. And so, yeah, getting the chance to talk it through is dope.
No, well, that's dope then. I mean, because ever since this was even a consideration, this was something that I've wanted to rap with you about. And and I've also, as we joked offline, uh, um, I was shocked to be made aware that you had this background. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. I'm supposed to be at least nominally in Africana studies. I'm trying to, keep up a little bit.
How come I
And
ain't see this brother coming? Is what, yeah.
I mean, but I mean, or I would have liked to have heard someone maybe make more of an emphasis of this,
Appreciate that.
just for my own selfish interest. And this is definitely something that I'm interested in, and we're interested in the scholarship and all of that. So I will remind everybody that we're not focusing on Dr. Ware's current gubernatorial run for governor of California. We'll put the link to that in the show description, and we'll put the link to the Remix morning show interview we just did the other day over on Black Liberation Media, so folks can get fully caught up on all of that. But today, as you mentioned, we are specifically wanting to talk about your scholarship, and I was made aware going like maybe even a year, but definitely months ago, that when I asked about it, I was just asking people in my circles, and they were, and at minimum, the folks who are aware of these topic areas were saying, no, 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 his work is serious. He does great work. Particularly my Muslim comrades were, he does great work on that overlap. And yeah, so I said, let me, so you sent me a little bit. I read at least this one chapter. I would definitely want to read more because it was fascinating. Uh, and uh, uh, and that's going to be the focus. So if there's not any other immediate preliminary from either of you, I was just going to ask you very much to just introduce us to what the chapter we're looking at today, and maybe give us a little bit of the context for in terms of your overall approach to this again overlap of Islam and African history. Of course, the chapter is called "The Book in Chains: Slavery and Revolution in Senegambia, 1770 to 1890." It's obviously part of a larger book and a larger body of work. So if we could just start broadly,
Yep.
and then we'll come to the narrow. Like, what is, if you could just introduce us to the work that you do.
So I'll go backwards. When I was doing my PhD at Penn, and I completed that degree in 2004, it was still a time where you really couldn't get trained in Africa and diaspora history at the same time in a history department. So I had to battle to get that profile that you discussed. So my primary fields was in Africa, pre-colonial African history, African American history, really not the early period, but really since 1865. So modern African American history was my focus, and Islamic intellectual history, because I wanted to bring the study of African Islam into dialogue with the Black studies tradition and with the Islamic studies tradition. So the piece that I sent is from my first book, The Walking Quran: Islamic Education, Embodied Knowledge, and History in West Africa. And I think that there's a lot of misconceptions in the African diaspora communities about the role of Islam historically, especially in West African societies. So a lot of people don't know that Africa is the only continent that has a Muslim majority, that there are more Black Muslims in sub-Saharan Africa than there are in North Africa by a factor of two, and that West Africa specifically was not incorporated into the lands of Islam through any kind of external military conquest. Our ancestors adopted Islam as a system of religious meaning and social organization voluntarily in a period where they were in positions of power. So the chapter that I had you guys read is that after the slave trade rises and begins to decimate West African societies, it was only natural that Muslim communities and Muslim scholars would become focal points for resisting this evil. And so the chapter that you guys read was about the way that Muslim scholars led anti-slavery revolutionary movements. And it actually goes back to the 1500s, but the kind of big piece of the story is an anti-slavery revolution in the Senegal River Valley that is the first modern republic to abolish the institution of slavery and the slave trade, abolishes monarchy, and does this as all part of a kind of critique of mercantile capitalism and slave trade and slavery as being of a piece. And it draws on no Western European Enlightenment traditions. These are jet black West African Muslims calling on their own histories and their own religious and social traditions within Islam to develop the most radical revolutionary anti-imperialist movement of the period. And it funnels directly into the Haitian Revolution, which is much more widely known. It has channels that have flowed into resistance movements all throughout the diaspora. And I'll just say this, is the book that I'm working to try to finish now before all of this politics has gotten in the way, really expands out from that chapter that I sent you guys. It's a book called The First Atlantic Revolution: Islam, Abolition, and Republic Before 1776. And that is so that people can understand that our ancestors didn't just start fighting against this tradition of enslavement and imperialism when we were sold into bondage in the New World. We was fighting it in Africa on the basis of, African historical experience. And in contradistinction to what some of the Hoteps think about Islam, like Islam was not an external colonizing tradition in this place. Islam was a radical revolutionary tradition in this place.
Geechee, do you want to jump in? Because that is definitely something I want to ask about at some point. But Geechee, let me.
Well, I mean, I guess I wanted to even stay there in terms of because there's this conversation around liberation theology and yeah, I'm curious to hear more about how you determine and or conclude that the utility of Islam, and I'm not saying that you're even saying this, is more liberatory or more in line with African revolutionary spirit. I'm just curious to hear you
Yeah.
run with that.
I mean, Professor, Cone, great, Black liberation, theologian, thinking through largely the Christian tradition. I definitely want my work, to be a point of engagement for people to see that there is a Black Muslim theological tradition of resistance as well. And you see it very early on. There's a series of papal bulls that are written in the 15 teens and 1520s, where they're trying to stop the importation of Muslims from West Africa into New Spain, into what's now Mexico. And people forget, that there's a good little African substrate, beneath that Mexican, population, because of those, 500,000, enslaved people that were brought to New Spain in the 16th century. But they were trying to stop Muslims from being imported because Muslims were so closely associated with slave rebellions, that the kind of ethic of justice, and also the organizational capacity, the fact that traditions of Muslim scholarship allowed Muslims to plan out slave rebellions and revolutions in writing. It allowed them to communicate with one another across ethnic and linguistic boundaries, whether you were Mandinka or Fulani or Wolof. If you might not be able to speak the same language, but you could write the same language so that you could plan. So early on, the Spanish and the Pope identified Muslims as particularly dangerous rebels. And part of the argument that I've made in other places in my work is that Islam has served as a vehicle for expressing kind of revolutionary solidarity, both because of the way that it articulates certain kinds of principles of resistance to oppression, but also just because of the simple organizing capacity that it allowed. It allowed Africans to build bonds that transcended their own ethno-linguistic or national boundaries. And so they were often at the cutting edge. Now, we obviously know that it wasn't only Muslims that resisted, right? We know that Africans, drew on their own ancestral and spiritual traditions of organizing and of spirituality wherever they came from. But it's just that Arabic literacy and Islam provided a particular, a particularly effective framing of that resistance, both in continental Africa and in slave rebellions and uprisings in the diaspora.
So, well, let me just start with the fact that in this chapter you've written, I feel like I got a reintroduction to an overview of a lot of history, and then obviously introduced for the first, well, not obviously, but for me, introduced for the first time to the level of detail that you bring to that specific region and time, all the influences happening. There's class dynamics, colonial dynamics, all kinds of things happening, and I'm happy to get there. I do, but I am curious about, because I really do struggle with, and my own biases coming out of from atheism through a Dr. Clark approach into African history.
Yep.
And
Don't
this was
hold back.
brought to me in grad school. No, I'm not. Oh, I'm not. I'm just trying to. I'm just trying to get the words right. But I was introduced in grad school because I became, like many, enamored with the work of Dr. Clark through lecture tapes, videos, books. Before I even got to grad school, then I go to grad school and realize after I got there, I didn't know before I got there that this was an important place, that the Africana Studies and Research Center at Cornell, under the founding directorship of the late great Dr. James Turner, as I like to remind everybody, he was a big. I didn't realize until then how much of an influence Clark had there and elsewhere, and with the people there. But I was also introduced to existing hostilities that came with that, between him and his approach to African and world history, and an understanding of religion, period, which he always said was the handmaiden of conquerors and male chauvinist murder cults. And then he said outright, "I don't like Arabs." And then he would talk about, I mean, I didn't realize that until later, but it was unavoidable. And then he said, "I don't like Islam, particularly because Islam gets away with a lot of stuff in terms of African people and African history." And then his whole point about the suppression of even African contribution to Islam, and all, and Arabism. The Arabism is what he kept calling it.
Yep.
So how do you distinguish, and how should we, as inexperts, so that bias was there, but I have not studied enough, but not enough to maybe rid myself of the bias, or to fully understand the complexity that you bring just in this one chapter.
Yeah.
So how do we best understand the relationship between Islam and African people?
Yeah. So, I mean, and just to be clear, John Henry Clark is, hero and intellectual mentor for me as well. Before I went to undergrad, I'm reading things like Chancellor Williams' Destruction of Black Civilization and other things that frame Islam and Arabs, first of all, it tethers them together, which there are reasons that you really need to be careful about doing that. I'll come to those in a minute. But then essentially equates them to a pre-European colonization that is both intellectual as well as intellectual and spiritual as well as political. And the problem when you really get into the source materials becomes very, very obvious, which is that John Henrik Clarke is not reading African Muslims writing in Arabic. John Henrik Clarke, Chancellor Williams is not reading African Muslims writing in Arabic. They are reading European narratives of an Islamic and Arab conquest of the African continent. And so there should have immediately been a red flag that went up. What is the source of this narrative? Oh, so this is just like the Africans and African Americans thing, where the man in the middle that is mediating diaspora knowledge about the continent and continental knowledge about the diaspora is a white supremacist who is shifting the narrative in particular ways. So as soon as I got into actually studying this, and as a practicing Muslim, it's hard. And don't get me wrong, like the thing I was most known for in the community before this was banging on Arabs for anti-blackness. Right? That is something that absolutely needs to be addressed. But when you start reading what the African Muslim sources themselves say, they tell a very different story. And it's not one that's mediated through European colonial discourse. And the European colonial discourse that framed Islam and Arab culture as a pre-European equivalent, a precise equivalent of European colonization, we should have smelled a rat, because that is essentially their efforts to minimize the violence of European imperialism and say we're just doing what the Arabs did before us, but less so. They also try to equate the so-called Arab or Islamic slave trade with the Atlantic slave trade, and that's always a rhetorical device to minimize the blood that's on their own hands and to say, look over there, that Arab dude, that's the bad guy. Right? So when you actually get into what jet black African Muslims themselves wrote, they tell a very different story. The African Muslim scholars are not alienated, colonized intellectuals. They're usually the first people to take the Arabic language and write down the oral traditions in African languages in their society. They're thoroughly immersed in their own cultures. They're not transplants from other places. They are indigenous families that adopt Islam. And it's not Arabs that spread Islam to West Africans. West Africans spread Islam to other West Africans. So there's all kind of misconceptions that get taken apart when you actually listen to what Black Muslims and African Muslims have said in their own languages, in their own sources, in their own narratives. And so
can we quickly clarify the languages that you speak so that and are studying in, because I think that should have
yes,
been brought up earlier, but I think that that's
sure.
important in addition to this.
So the predominant colonial language in West Africa, the Muslim regions of West Africa, is French. So I speak and read French fluently. The Wolof language is the vernacular language that's spoken through the Senegambia region. I speak and read the Wolof language fluently. Arabic is the textual tradition that unites West African civilization. It's not usually a spoken language through most of West Africa. That people learn it the way that Europeans learn Latin. It's a scholarly language. So I read and write Arabic. I don't really speak Arabic, although in casual conversation, with Arabs I can speak. But those are the principal languages of research. For the chapter that you guys have, it was actually, the English that my mama and daddy taught me that came in handy, because while Senegal, where this revolutionary story that I tell in that chapter took place, was a French colony for much of the period, and it was under French imperial domination. There's actually a period where the British take Senegal, and it was going to the British Public Records Office and utilizing some of the English language sources that the Senegalese scholars had not consulted because they were in English. That actually ended up being a key to unlocking a lot of the narratives that are in the chapter that you now have. But those are the principal languages for the study. And some Fulani. Now, I don't speak Fulani enough to do it. So in all of my oral history work in Wolof, I always do that without any interpreter. I conduct those interviews myself. If I have to go to Fulani or Mandinka, then I get help.
So not too long ago, maybe like a less than a year ago, I was made aware that Martin Delaney was named mayor in Nicaragua somewhere. And and he wasn't even in Nicaragua yet, but his idea was he was gonna go there, gain some strength like a Moor or Maroon, and then
Yep.
come back and get his people. But he was going off of the sources of white men like Vanderbilt and other clowns like that.
Yeah.
So I think that's a powerful statement that you made about John Henry Clark. And I'm curious, like, how would you? And maybe this is a bigger question, and you kind of accomplished it in the article. I mean, the chapter. How would you help African people clean their palate on slavery and Islam and how they understand it?
Yeah, I mean, so this is one of the reasons. So I point them to things that I wrote. So Cambridge World History of Slavery, which is as authoritative, the kind of academic canon. I contributed the chapters on Islamic Africa for volumes 3 and volume 4. So I am the authoritative voice on that particular question in both Afrocentric circles and the lily white academic canon, because as Professor Ball pointed out, like I'm bringing it down to a granular level at the sources and showing you that the picture that you have of slavery and Islam does not correspond with the historical reality. The first part to kind of unpack is that people don't understand is that most of the so-called Arab slave trade evolves coterminous with the Atlantic slave trade. It's essentially a secondary economic market that is growing out of the Atlantic slave trade. And the massive uh, acceleration and enslavement in the Arab world takes place in the 19th century after Europeans abolished the international trade. Essentially, markets for captive Black bodies shift eastward. And so you have very late arising, but very, very deep and profound impacts of slavery in Gulf societies and other parts of the Muslim world. Most of that takes place in the 19th century. And so, but people remember the last thing that they've seen, right? So you see that, heavy imprint of anti-Blackness in a place like Egypt, for example. What a lot of people don't know is that in the 1500s, Blacks were a tiny minority amongst the slave population in Egypt. It's that as the Atlantic slave trade produces a market that commoditizes Black bodies, now all of a sudden you see more and more enslaved Blacks in a place like Egypt. But the critical factor is that literally the American Civil War decimates cotton production in the US South. In order to boost their cotton production in Egypt, under Ottoman control, the Ottomans invade the Sudan and enslave people for the first time on massive scale, and to literally put them to work on cotton plantations. So us getting free produced a bunch of Sudanese bondage in Egypt, right? And that's how the markets were interconnected. So I tell that story as an economic historian, not just as a social historian or as a historian of religion. And once you start to see what's actually taking place, you realize that what's happening is that from the time the Europeans open up the so-called New World and start bringing those 13 to 20 million enslaved Africans in bondage, they've created a new global market for commoditized Black bodies. And if we were being honest, we wouldn't tell a story about an Arab slave trade or an Atlantic slave trade. It's not even Atlantic. The Europeans are trading a quarter of their slaves in the Indian Ocean, right? That's where the Dutch are most active. That's where the Portuguese are largely active. We would be talking about a single European-driven global market for Black bodies. It's just that Arabs end up being purchasers, especially later in that period.
So the narrative that I was certainly raised on, that was even supported when I was in briefly myself East Africa,
Yep.
that the the so-called trade in Africans among Arabs predated by hundreds of years Europeans' involvement, and that weakened the continent and made it easier for Europe to do what it did. That's also upside down and backwards, is what
It's
you're
not
saying.
it's not supported by the sources. So
Wow.
when you get so there's a really interesting scholar, Thomas Vernet, French scholar, who dug into the source materials, and what he shows is that what's actually taking place in East Africa before the Europeans come is that there is no mainland the Muslim populations on the coast, first of all, they're not Arabs, they're Swahili. They're speaking a Bantu language, and they're not some kind of mixed race population. They're essentially a Bantu population that speaks a Bantu language with some Arabic loan words in it. There is no mainland raiding from that Muslim population to the interior. There's no enslavement of the Swahili people of their neighbors, nor is there Arab enslavement of the Swahili. What he documents, and the Portuguese write this out. I don't read Portuguese, so I'm glad Thomas Vernet did this work, is that when the Portuguese get there in the 1500s, what they document is that there are Swahili merchants that are actually going to the island of Madagascar, and they're purchasing enslaved Malagasy. And that is the only slave trade that's being operated on the East African coast when the Portuguese get there. Now, think about this. These are Africans speaking a Bantu language going to Madagascar to purchase people that are speaking an Indonesian language, an Austronesian language, and selling them to Arabs in the Gulf. That doesn't correspond with that narrative about Arabs over Africans now, does it? But that story gets completely buried because in the 19th century, Zanzibar becomes the center of the East African slave trade, and it dwarfs all of the historical experience. And people project back into the deep past the dynamics of Zanzibar in the 19th century. So you'll hear people say wild stuff like there were 100 million Africans, traded to. It's like, nah, bro. Like I've counted them, and when you really actually get into the footnotes, you realize that European scholars are literally making up numbers for the Arab slave trade. Every time an estimate of the Atlantic slave trade, which is based on a careful count, goes up. Phil Curtin did the first ones at 9 million, and it keeps going up, keeps going. Every time you count, you find new enslaved Africans in the Atlantic world.
Because Phil Curtin got a bad rep in Africana studies. That's like a bad word.
Because he's trash. Because he was a white supremacist, studying African history, But the point, and he wanted to minimize those numbers. He said it's 9 million, and if it ever has to be adjusted, it will be adjusted downwards rather than upwards. Well, nigga, we still counting. Like every time we do a new count, the number gets higher. But what the point that I wanted to make though is that every time that count is done for the so-called Atlantic trade, because I don't call it that in my work, I call it the Euro-American slave trade, because it's Europeans and Americans that conduct the trade, and they do it in the Indian Ocean, not just in the Atlantic. But every time a count of the Euro-American slave trade raises the number, then a scholar will come along and also raise the number of the so-called Arab slave trade to match it. But when you dig into the footnotes that they're using, they're literally just making up numbers. None of it would pass. We wouldn't pass our exams with that level of, kind of flimsy documentation for any of our claims. So you can see that it's just a rhetorical strategy to demonize Arabs and to minimize the colonial impact of European intervention. Last point on this, because I know I've said too much, but the most perverted aspect of it is that the mission civilisatrice, the civilizing mission of the French, and the white man's burden in the 19th century, when they switched from that slave trading imperialism to direct colonization, irony of all ironies, the argument that they made was Arabs have been ravaging the continent for centuries. We have to go in to colonize to put an end to slavery and the slave trade. So they use this rhetorical argument that John Henrik Clarke borrowed and that Chancellor Williams borrowed without checking the footnotes, literally in order to justify mainland imperialism, the new kind of colonial dispossession. So when you understand how flimsy that narrative is, where it comes from, what its rhetorical purposes were in European sources, you realize, oh man, the man got me good. Like I'm recycling this white supremacist narrative and incorporating it into my supposedly Afrocentric disposition. When jet black African Muslims have been, thoroughly immersed, 10 toes down in their society, not alienated, intellectually or culturally, and have been some of the principal resistors of this evil. And that's what that chapter is about, is how they drew on their own traditions to resist effectively, to literally end the slave trade, to create a 35-year gap in the history of the slave trade in this region. And it's a radical history, it's a radical history. And I'm a radical and a historian. So like working through that chapter is the center of that book. And I really do hope that political life will allow me to finish the first Atlantic Revolution information because I'm about 60,000 words into what I think will be a 90,000 word book, and I really need to get that thing finished because it's a story that I want more Black study scholars to engage with. I mean, I don't feel like you have anything to apologize for not hearing from my work because I feel like it largely got siloed in African history circles or in African study circles or Islamic study circles.
No, no, no. First of all, it's mostly because I'm just not doing due diligence. That's all. I'm just not keeping up.
Which
That's really it. It was just more of a kind of semi-ironic, used intentionally and literally in this case, point about how can I not know? How could this especially given all the time and attention paid to the political work. So that's all I'm saying. Like it's no, there's no, it's more my issue. And the work, the work, from my humble vantage point, is dope. It's fascinating.
well,
Um,
I can't put I
Go
can't
ahead.
put this Hubert Harrison down by Brian Koba, but so again, all the light skinned brothers I know, including one who passed away, my brother Asafo, you, Butch, and Jared, y'all come very strong, and as Hubert Harrison says, for those who live by the people must be careful of the people's gods with a little g, and so whenever you're able to lay down a critique and then share that even some of our celebrated greats regurgitated a myth or
Yeah,
some bullshit,
yeah.
y'all better watch your head, both of y'all.
It's, I mean, it's true, but I will say this. I'll tell you what. I'll give you options, and rather than just taking somebody down, I'll raise somebody up. Edward Wilmot Blyden.
Blyden.
If you read Christianity, Islam, and the Negro race, right? He did not get baited into these tropes, and the reason is that Blyden read Arabic and spoke Arabic, so he
Mm.
conversed with the Muslim scholars in the hinterland of Sierra Leone, in the hinterland of Liberia. I actually realized when I was teaching last quarter that Blyden wrote on El Umar Tal, one of the great resistance leaders that I talk about in my book. And I'd never realized that Blyden had written about Tal contemporaneously. Like he was, basically writing in the period right after Tal's activities. And that's what allowed him to have a critical disposition. He remained a practicing Christian, and you can remain a practicing or not practicing atheist and still have respect for the way that the African Islamic tradition has moved differently with respect to colonial dynamics than Christianity. He remained a Christian, but he said that the biggest issue is that he said the Negro Mohammedan has no inferiority complex, unlike the Negro Christian. He said because they're not integrated into the system of religious belief as a submissive second, but rather they're learning it from scholars that look like them, that have no inferiority complex, and they're writing their mother tongues with the Arabic script as much as they're writing Arabic. So there's just a very different relationship between Islamic knowledge and Arabic literacy in West Africa than many of us, you know. I mean, I was proudly raised as a Hotep, like I'm Afrocentric before anything else, before
No,
that became an entirely ironic term. You know what I'm saying? But we have to disabuse ourselves of some of these notions.
listen, I absolutely, and however we feel about certain individuals, what they meant to us personally or whatever, it's not really relevant if we're trying to understand what is really going on and what really happened. And I will say, and it's unfortunate we never got a chance to really get past an initial build, but a late elder some years ago pulled my coat at a conference and basically said very aggressively, what you think you understand about the world through Dr. Clark is wrong, primarily because he did not read anything beyond the English language. And this was, and he said some things to me that similar to what you're saying in terms of what happens when we don't read Arabic, French, and
Portuguese,
particularly,
I mentioned Portuguese. Yep, yep.
but in particular, indigenous African languages.
Exactly.
Like so this person was telling me that, you basically you got to let some things go. and or do better yourself, which I have not done, to become multilingual and conversant, or at the level of scholarship. So I fully appreciate what you're saying, and what you're arguing here. Now, specifically to your chapter,
Yes.
I would like you to give us a summary of what you're saying in here, and then we can maybe talk a little bit about how what we've been talking about so far overlaps. Because I just admit, there's so much in there. I won't pretend that I digested all of it, and all I kept walking away from is that this is why Pan Africanism is so necessary. Because all I kept feeling like I was hearing in the chapter is colonizers play on any and every division they can find. They will foster any and every division, and they will wait. They'll give you a couple generations even, and they got long memories and resources, and they will come back again. And if you don't have everything, and so you do a lot in this chapter, but that's one overriding theme that I walked away. But please talk to us a little bit more specifically about
Uh,
what's in here.
so um, here's how I would introduce it. Epiphany moment came when I came across a source from the Reverend Thomas Clarkson. So Thomas Clarkson was the teacher of William Wilberforce. So Wilberforce is often associated as the kind of founder of the British abolitionist tradition, but actually Clarkson was his tutor in all things abolition. Clarkson was the founder of the London Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade. And when I dug into the French sources, I found that he's actually also the founder of La Société des Amis des Noirs, the Society of the Friends of the Blacks, which is the first French abolitionist society. It's just that the French-British rivalry was such that they had to name him just a founding member. They couldn't name him as the actual founder, but it was his impetus that led to the creation of the organization. His first book on the subject, he publishes in French. It's Letters on the Slave Trade. He later translated it into English. And in it, he tells the story of Abdul Qadir Khan, a Senegalese Muslim leader who he says abolishes the slave trade and slavery. And he said, this African Muslim, he said, has done more than any of the sovereigns of Europe for the causes of liberty, humanity, justice, and religion. And he devotes almost 30% of the word count in his first treatise to telling the story of this Senegambian uprising against slavery. And he says, this African Muslim has done what the European Christians don't have the nerve to do. So he cites African Muslims as laying down the groundwork for what will be the European abolitionist movement. And when I saw that, it connected with things that I've been studying about Khan through the oral tradition, and that's when I knew to dig in deeper. And basically, what I do in the story in that chapter is on the basis of oral traditions, Arabic documents from slave traders, documents from a bunch of contemporaneous documentation. I show that a Muslim clerical group, Muslim scholars and teachers in league with formerly enslaved people, overthrow the slave trading authorities that were in league with Europeans. And not only do they kind of flip that into a true revolution, but they abolish the institution of slavery and the slave trade simultaneously, and are able to keep the Senegal River Valley slavery free for 35 years until Khan himself is assassinated. And as you pointed out, they got long memories and deep pockets. The empire strikes back. And because the empire strikes back, much of this narrative was forgotten. It was buried because it is such a subversive narrative to say that the genealogies of liberty, remember, this is a Republican revolution. It's a revolution that abolishes monarchy and establishes representative forms of democracy in its place. That the roots of Republican of Republican governance, the roots of anti-slavery and abolition, of emancipatory thought, those were located firmly inside African and Muslim intellectual genealogies before they take root in European or Christian intellectual genealogies. And the book that I'm writing now, I've actually been able to follow enslaved lieutenants in this movement to slave rebellions in Antigua and in South Carolina and a bunch of other places. They were exporting this revolution. I found a person who was fighting alongside Abdul Qadir Khan in 1796, is enslaved in a major battle, sold into slavery, and is fighting alongside Toussaint Louverture 2 years later. Makes his way back to Senegal in the 1820s as a free man and tells his story to the French governor of Senegal at that time. And one of the principal sources that, yeah, this emancipation actually happened is literally a French governor of Senegal who was a kid in Senegal when this was taking place. And he said that the Fulani were proud to say that they had gone ahead of us in the causes of liberty and humanity. Like this is the most civilized people on the planet, and they told us so, right? But that story disappears because it's such a subversive story to say that we are the source on the basis of our own indigenous and ancestral legacies of true emancipatory practice and praxis. And you can see that in all kinds of, you see it in the Haitian Revolution and other places, but a lot of folks don't understand that this is taking place in Africa before it's even taking place in the diaspora.
So I'm pretty sure there's still a strain of people who probably listening to some of John Henry Clark's lines and the most famous lines.
Yeah.
Um, but for those who might say that, okay, well, because there's the literature that says Khan had a interesting twist on abolitionism, and even though he interrupts ships and was able to get people free, there's this argument around non-Islamic people were still enslaved by him. So could you respond to that?
Yeah, so that's actually not the case. That's not what the documentary sources say, and that's what does distinguish between the true, really radical nature of Khan's revolutionary activity and another anti-slavery champion like Sheikh Uthman Danfodio in northern Nigeria. Uthman Danfodio is explicitly fighting against the slave trade, and he's liberating Muslim slaves, but ultimately they end up holding the position that non-Muslims can still be enslaved according to Islamic law. But what happens in Khan's revolution is decidedly different, and this part is clearly documented both by contemporary European sources and in the oral tradition. Khan says that the person that is to be protected, the Muslim to be protected from the indignities of enslavement, is the one that says La ilaha illallah, even if they pronounce it Ra ilaha illallah. So what he means is that because Islamic law has this mechanism through which Muslims are forbidden from enslaving other Muslims and always have been, I will extend protection, that formal legal protection, to anyone who even pretends to be Muslim. And I will defend myself against any scholarly argument by using this shield. But the point is that he's using Muslim identity as a way to shield everyone from enslavement rather than as a sword to subject some people to enslavement. All of the contemporary sources and later sources are clear. Anyone that will recite a single verse of the Quran in Khan's Futatoro is immediately freed. Now, what that means is that a single verse, there are verses of the Quran that are comprised of a single Arabic letter. The letter Q, Qaf in Arabic, is a verse. Say Qaf and you're free.
But you still gotta say it though. So when I read that, I was really, really struggling. Like I was like, but you still gotta say it. And it's like,
but the
and then
point,
and
but
as
the
your
point,
chapter
no,
talk,
no,
go
no,
ahead,
no.
go
But the
ahead, go
point,
ahead,
but
go
the
ahead.
point, no, actually the point is that you don't. The point is that he has said that in order to protect himself from conservative jurists that might make a counter argument. There's no documentation. What the contemporary documentation says is that anybody that fled from bondage that set foot in Futatoro was free, and that the whole area was being depopulated precisely because of this, right? So yes, it's true that he is still using an Islamic mechanism, but you also have to understand that Senegambia by that time is already 95, 96% Muslim. There are very few people that are not nominally Muslim already to begin with. So yes, I understand how to our eyes it looks like it's a kind of religiously exclusionary model. The entire environment is Muslim to begin with, right? And the only people that are being denied access to a kind of full participation in society as Muslims are people that are of slave background. And he's basically saying, I don't care if you come here, you're free.
I'm sorry, Shirley
Go
got me
ahead.
laughing. I'm sorry. Damn, Jared, you didn't want to be free or what? I'm just saying. No,
Just say
listen,
free.
listen, listen.
That's it.
Let me be clear. I'm saying it. Let me just be clear.
But I mean, real talk,
In my mind, as I was reading the chapter, I was like,
but let's be honest. The European Christian abolitionists of that period are also framing their abolitionist intervention through their own Christian religious experience. I mean, let's just be
Mhm.
be clear about that. They're thinking of everybody as a Christian, so that even an enslaved Muslim, for example, such as Abdurrahman ibn Suri. That there's a great documentary with Mos Def as the narrator called Prince Among Slaves about his life. He's enslaved in 1788, spends 40 years in bondage in Natchez, Mississippi. He gets free because he's literate in Arabic, because he comes from this scholarly tradition. But they treat the abolitionist societies assume that he's Christian, and they treat him like a Christian, and they ask him to write a copy of the Lord's Prayer, and he writes Fatiha instead, in Arabic, because they're also processing, abolitionism through their own religious and moral lens. So to expect African Muslims to not do so as well, and to judge them by a 21st century tape as opposed to an 18th century tape, when they're essentially effectively offering, because they're offering universal emancipation, and there are no religious police that are following up to see if you're praying or not praying, or if you're really Muslim or not Muslim. When he says, the one is to be protected, they say La ilaha illallah, even if they pronounce it Ra iraha irara. That was a stereotypical way of describing the few minority groups that weren't Muslim in the southern part of the zone. He was like, yeah, I don't care. I'm not asking any questions. Get here and you're free.
no, right on, right on. So one of the questions that I had that also, and maybe you could use reference to the chapter or any other part of your work or whatever
Yeah.
to help answer, but uh, because it again, as I'm admittedly reading relatively quickly, trying to prepare for today, and I'm not digesting everything, and a lot of this is brand new to me. So but what I kept wanting to ask is just what I always am curious about, and others have written about over time, and obviously, I've thought again of the late Ali Mazzoui, and the triple heritage, and that the question of who gets the credit was the way I formulated it in my head. Like when something good or bad happens, who gets the credit or the blame? Is it the religion that, as you write about in this chapter, doesn't explicitly forbid slavery per se, uh even as others are making use of it to free and liberate? It doesn't, so if something good or bad happened, is it because of Islam? Is it Africans being African under the guise of Islam, or under the practice of is it Africans practicing Islam that makes it what it is, or is it the Islam that does it? Is it the pressure of colonization? Is it a product of just biochemical, natural humanity? How do you how does what does your approach and your view of it suggest about, yeah,
So
who
I'm
the
drinking
credit and the blame?
my coffee with milk. I'm drinking my coffee with milk, and there's an expression that you'll hear in contemporary Wolof, that the thing is like coffee mixed with milk. Bagabole nam, bagabole tur. You either got to drink the whole thing or pour the whole thing out. And the reason why I'm citing that is that Islam is present in these parts of West Africa for 1,200 years. It is a traditional African religion in these places. It is so thoroughly, interwoven with indigenous African culture that you either drink the whole thing or you pour the whole thing out. And the one thing that I'll say, is that like I don't want to make it sound as though the religion is okay with slavery. That's one of the things that I write in the Cambridge World History of Slavery, is that there is a long tradition of anti-slavery thought that Khan is drawing on when he makes these legal positions. There were early scholars that said that the Prophet's own example was to free the bondsmen, and if Muslims were serious about following it, then slavery would have died off within a generation. Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba, whose community of the Murid Sufi order was my first host in Senegal and really taught me much of what I know. Someone once tried to present Bamba with the gift of an enslaved person, and he says, "You own this man?" And the man said, "Yeah." And he said, "If you own him, then you own me, because he and I have the same master." And that is that's the African Islamic disposition towards enslavement that I was taught, that I learned when I started going to Senegal in the beginning. And that is coming from our culture, our historical experience, and from Islamic doctrine and teaching. And many of my own teachers, one of my teachers, Imam Fode Drame, great Senegambian scholar, he's currently based in Vancouver. When he saw me presenting this academic work, he said, Bilal, he called me by my Muslim name. He said, "Bilal, please make sure you get this work out." He said, "This is the single most misunderstood aspect of the Sunnah." In other words, this is the single most misunderstood piece of early Islamic history. And there were Senegalese scholars that said this. They said that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, sought to end this institution, and he took every mechanism that he could. But what happened afterwards is that the so-called caliphate became an imperial slaving power in North Africa, and therefore normalized a bunch of things that had no place in the tradition. So it's not surprising that it was jet black West African Muslims under the pressure of the Atlantic slave trade that were able to bring back this foundational thread in Islamic history and morality and pull on it, not just in theory or liberation theology, but in revolutionary practice to actually build polity on the basis of this kind of revolutionary ethics.
So I'm curious. I've been having a struggle with having people explain to me what abolitionism is, or what being an abolitionist is. And I know in the piece you talk about European abolitionism, con abolitionism, and then even there's people who argue that, well, uh, religion should be abolished as well, right? So could you kind of give me like maybe your definition, or how you describe abolitionism, and in that definition, do it also talks about what is to be built, or what is like abolish something, but then
Yeah, this is a great opportunity to make a linkage between kind of contemporary abolitionism and the historic abolitionism that we're discussing. When I first got on social media, it was after George Floyd was murdered in 2020. And on the basis of my scholarly work and academic writing, I said that if we do not see the contemporary carceral state as the natural extension of the institutions of enslavement that kept us in bondage, and if we do not strive as abolitionists to end that carceral state the same way that our African and Muslim ancestors strove as abolitionists to end slavery, then we have betrayed their legacy. So for me, there's a direct relationship between contemporary abolitionism, the struggle against carceral states and punitive forms of so-called justice, and the struggle against bondage. And its bridge is obvious. It's the 13th Amendment, that slavery is outlawed except as punishment of a crime. And if you study African history, you see that every single time, this happens in South Africa in 1835, when slavery is abolished there, immediately a carceral apparatus emerges to resubmit Black people to bondage. So for me, contemporary abolitionism is a continuation of Khan's struggle. And to define contemporary abolition, it is that people should have access to health care, housing, and their basic needs without being subjected to state violence. That in the end, that a carceral state is by definition a violent state that has to produce human bondage, and a capitalist state that has to exploit and extract, especially from its most marginalized populations. So for me, as a contemporary abolitionist, I see myself as farming in a field that people like Abdul Qadir Khan cleared. And it was a little spot on, frankly, when I got invited to run for vice president. up against a white supremacist genocide in Gaza on a reparations platform, I realized that most of the people that I had written about in the Walking Quran were African Muslims who were teaching their students, building community, doing the work with that we now, think of as kind of community work. And then they got tagged into the fight against white supremacy and imperialism because it washed up on their shores. So Khan has to fight against the slave trade. Bamba has to resist European imperialism. We're still facing those same challenges, and we should be able to draw on our traditions of resistance. That abolitionism isn't something that comes out of European post-enlightenment rationalist thought. It's something that emerges organically out of African resistance struggles and from our ancestral traditions, both indigenous and Islamic.
So as we move into this second, will have to be, unfortunately for me, a concluding hour here. If you're good with that amount of time, I don't know if we even confirmed it.
I've got a team. We've got a team meeting that's starting shortly, but I'll give you as much of the next.
Oh, okay. Well, then let me do this then.
Yeah.
Damn. Okay. Let me.
I didn't
Okay.
know we were booked for 2, so pardon me for that. My team booked
No,
me.
no, no. That's my fault. That's my fault. It's my fault. We can do more. We can do more. There were questions that I was saving that admittedly not drag us, and I don't mean to be pejorative, that would take us away from the immediate topic. And I for now want to stay as much on this as we can. So I will email your team immediately and start to book another follow-up
Would love that.
and particular to the work, but also we can maybe do another political one as well. But especially as the campaign goes on, that's fine. But I did want, if you could, one of the things that I definitely wanted to ask is that again, I was struggling with this. Could you talk a little bit about the because of course you have to deal with the French getting involved in the Senegambia. But could you talk about the world that the French show up into? Like if we could decenter the whites as much as possible and just talk about Africa, the Senegambia region that you're writing about before the Europeans show up. Because there's so much happening in your chat. I mean, it's wild how much you and it's well written in there. I mean, it's there's just a lot in there.
Yeah.
That they come in and end up trying to exploit and take advantage of. But what is that society like? And then maybe we can start to head towards a close for this part one.
And thank you for that invitation, because it's the thing that I'm most proud of in my first book is that there is not a single reference to any European theorist in the book. That the entire intellectual and epistemological apparatus of the book comes out of African and Islamic ontologies and epistemologies and cosmologies. So the whole thing is written with us as the center and Europe as the periphery, Europe as the margin. And that's what I'm most proud of to this day of that book, with that book, is that I'm not writing so there's a kind of colonial endeavor in much Africanist work, which is that you're essentially translating how an African society works to a European audience. And I'm not doing that. I'm writing from inside an African Islamic epistemology and telling a story that makes sense from the inside. So in that, the Europeans are never going to be the central part of the story because the story is being driven by African dynamics. The fundamental African dynamic that I want to draw people's attention to in the book is that precisely because Islam comes first with merchants and scholars across the Sahara into already strong and flourishing West African societies, Islam is integrated into those societies on African terms. It's not a colonizing force that comes from the outside, and it's indigenous West Africans that do the work of spreading Islam in the society, and that is centered principally on schooling. It's not military or political, it's educational. And literacy is spreading with it. Literacy, not just in Arabic, but also in African languages. So it's deepening and memorializing African cultural forms. The poetry gets written down for the first time and those things. So this is a society where where religious scholars in the Islamic tradition are jet black and are known to be, down by law. They're not copying some Arabs someplace else or white people's someplace else. So they're thoroughly integrated into the society. And as the evils of the time start to wash up on the shores, it is understandable that scholarly communities, which have traditionally served as kind of safe havens, historically in the region, become places that become centers of resistance. And the reason why they became safe havens is that because Islam wasn't mixed up with the political system, it was really more cultural and educational. There had always been a division between the religious state and the political state. Even when the rulers were Muslims, scholars were their own separate autonomous class. And it was their job to provide autonomous ethical critique of the political sphere. So this is part of the reason why they become so consistently radical, is because the society is expecting them to be the ones that speak truth to power. Islam is not integrated into a kind of um, functionary capacity the way that it is in North Africa with an imperial state that then has scholars that do the work. Abdul Qadir Khan, before the revolution, is a judge that has no state structure behind him. People come and submit their cases for adjudication just on the basis of his reputation for integrity and scholarship. And they have to agree, like y'all are old enough to remember Judge Wapner, right? That there's no state behind that ruling. The people in the courtroom agree to his arbitration as binding. They did it for a TV show in West Africa. The most of the scholars did it just on the basis of like their knowledge and reputation in the community as being disinterested, ethical agents and actors. So when you understand that this is where Islam is rooted and anchored, you realize, man, it really is a long way from that colonizer model that people like John Henrik Clarke thought Islam was operating under. And you can really see why revolutionary potential was embedded at this interface between African tradition and Islam in this particular place.
Dr. Ware, this has been great. I look forward to parts 2 and on. Again, we've been talking a little bit about an excerpt from the Walking Quran. The link to Dr. Ware's work and more is in the show description, as is the link to our discussion the other day on the Remix Morning Show about his political campaign for governor in California. So you can go back and watch all of that. And Dr. Ware, we'll be looking to build with you again. This has been great. Thank you very much.
Let's get that next hour booked sooner than later, because I mean, I love talking through the history of our people. Malcolm said, of all of our fields of study, history is best qualified to reward our research. And so I'm finding daily the inspiration to fight the struggle in this time through the careful study of the way that our ancestors laid their revolutionary game down. So yeah, it's a pleasure. I love this talk and looking
Right
forward.
on.
Yeah. Peace.
Yes, indeed. Take care. Peace, peace, peace,
Appreciate you.
peace.
Peace.
We definitely say peace to Dr. Ware, knowing he'll be out there looking to fight for it, as Fred Hampton used to say. Geechee, it's been a pleasure having you jump back on with me. This has been good. Any if you got a minute, any thoughts? I don't know if we're capable of answering all the questions here, but we can go through a couple of them if you know.
Yeah,
If you got a
no,
minute.
I think that wait, wasn't it John Henry Clark who called for a serious Islam scholar, or was it a Christian scholar? I feel
Honestly,
like
I don't recall other to be perfectly honest, I don't recall much that he said about it that wasn't hostile.
yeah,
Uh,
I remember he was saying something about debating a serious Islamic scholar, something like that. But anyway, all that to say, like I do appreciate. I mean, I think I know some solid people who practice or who are a part of Islam, but I don't think I've ever actually talked to
well,
somebody who has in depth
yeah, I
scholarship.
mean, we know a lot. I mean, I feel like I know a lot of people personally and politically who are Muslims of a variety, and obviously, some of our leading political prisoners. Jamil Al-Amin is still locked up. Drouba, Jalil Muttaqin. These are all Muslims. Uh, uh, um,
Mhm.
well, I just went blank, but everybody, but but I don't engage with them in this way. So in terms of the history and the scholarship and the language, so this was good. Thank you, ZZ Lion, for the super chat. My 2 cents. As an atheist, I'm struggling. I do appreciate the history. The problem I see with the milk, if you're a vegan, regardless if it came from a cow, the birth of Islam out of Christianity, from the godfather of Judaism. I get it. And I have that similar issue. I mean, I admit it. You know, but but in reading this chapter, I'm just reminded again of a lot of my own shortcomings as a scholar, as an intellectual, in terms specifically around being monolingual and not studying these histories in any other language. And also in this chapter alone, there's just a lot of complexity over the overlap and the interplay. So you know, I just think it's at minimum a fascinating history that I think a lot of us would have to admit we don't know as much about, even if we're in the chat constantly typing in all caps.
Yep, so they said that person is Adolf, so I don't know. But I I think I guess being in like I guess academic spaces, online, left politics, and then organizing, like it kind of goes back to like people are arguing about sources that they have or haven't checked or read. Um, that's supposedly shaping their politics, and is really the behaviors that I try to be hyper focused on, like what type of behaviors are these people showing up today? What are they working on or fighting for? And I feel like I don't know. That's the kind of conversation I'm more interested in. Like what it like based off of what you read and whatever source you have. What is your politic? As I've asked people that question about abolitionism, and I don't think I've ever heard that answer. But what are you practicing? What are you building? And I think that's kind of what I'm more curious about, as opposed to having like a hard stance on like being anti something that I really don't know much about or haven't did a deep dive in. And then the point again in doing a deep dive, like I did a deep dive in a lot of European language around Christianity, and they contradict themselves in a way that made me uh, clearer. But with Islam, I can't say that I've done any like deep studying past the little things that probably was even given through a white Christian lens of assessment of Islam anyway. So
Yeah, um so first of all, and I just I just want to remind folks that in whatever limited space I have any control over, the goal is to have some sort of principled engagement. We don't all have to agree, but I'm not going to be here for all the yelling and the lying and the misrepresentation. There's plenty of room for discussion, and where we disagree, we can disagree, but and or read the work. I mean, that's another. If we're taking lessons from today, read, beloved, and and like
You just don't read, beloved.
put a drop. Yeah.
and then come back like the I yeah. Anyway, I also don't. I also, and maybe this is something that just is my version of aging, but I also am increasingly appreciating having some of my core beliefs challenged. Doesn't mean I'm just going to change them, but I don't mind them being challenged, and we can see if they can withstand it, and it shouldn't be a problem to hear a different view, especially one where you can admit to yourself you're not an expert in. I mean, very few of us are and I admit a bias around this too. Like I think that someone who took the time to study French, Wolof, Arabic, not that everything they say should be taken, for just as gold standard or whatever, but it should be at least appreciated and considered before we just dismiss it.
Mhm.
Um, but anyway, that's. But okay, listen. Uh, no, Geechee, this has been great, man. I look forward to doing this again, and with you and bringing Dr. Ware back around. And please, everybody, like, share, subscribe. Do the same over on Black Liberation Media as well, and where you can see more of Geechee and all of us. So, any last comments, questions, queries, conundrums?
Nah, man, appreciate the invite, and yeah, this was good. I actually think I needed this type of focus on this particular topic. So like that was a good read. I was simultaneously reading that and Hubert Harrison. I can't put the book down, so that's
And what is it? What is Jamon saying? You can't wait to. Oh yeah, can't wait to read some of the Brian Quoba book for that reason. Yeah,
man.
yeah,
Listen,
yeah, yeah.
I've been waiting for this for a long time, bro.
Yeah,
So
he did his thing in that thing. He did his
yeah,
thing in that thing. Yeah.
yeah, and actually, it just made me think like Harrison's position on Islam is interesting, but uh Blyden had him by 50 years, so I'm not sure why he didn't read. Maybe he just dismissed Blyden. I
Wait,
don't
say
know.
that again.
Blyden, like uh Butch was just saying Blyden had some clarity around not using European sources when he
Oh,
studied Islam, and Blyden had Harrison by 50 years, so he could have studied or read or engaged Blyden at some point. And I'm just curious if he did, not to mention, because I mean, I know John Henry Clark is younger, but he was a part of the Blyden Society with Kwame and Nkrumah and all these other people. So I'm just I'm waiting to see if Brian even talks about Blyden because I didn't get too far in it, but I would love to see
I don't
them
remember
in.
that coming up in the sections I read. I read, I don't know, three chapters of it. I don't
Mhm.
remember Blinding, but then again, that don't mean nothing that I don't remember. So, but it um no, that's a good question. I do think I think Quoba touches on a number of reasons why Harrison has been pushed to the side, and I think my bias says it starts with the atheism, and then he said I misread. I don't know, maybe I misread it, but the fluidity is the word that was used to describe Claude McKay's sexuality in the book.
Mhm.
Uh, um, so I don't know if it was an allusion to some other than heterosexual interests of Harrison, or just Harrison's just clear, apparently, to what is the word I'm looking for? I don't want to. Promiscuity has a bad react, connotation, but he was doing his thing apparently, and
Anybody can get
and
it.
anybody could maybe. So between those two things, I feel like people, but none of those are reasons that someone like Harrison should be as marginalized as he's become, uh, even in some radical circles. So I just find all of that interesting, and I don't know if that had anything to do with Clark and his crew. Although Clark did, of course, talk about Harrison and bigged him up and all of that,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
as
yeah.
did J.R. Rogers and
Mhm.
and all of that. But I don't know. But then again, I mean, everybody's like, who's your top five or top three, and that means that a whole bunch of really great people in all these areas are going to be left out.
Yeah.
Uh, thanks for the super chat, Jay Mejia. Character holding their head in their hands. Oh, I'm just reading out saying you're my number one. All right, I'm not sure I entirely get
I feel like
but
just
but thanks for the
just
super chat.
the little bit I studied before and then going into this, I feel like Harrison like is in between like radical black folks and radical white people. and he's probably too radical for some of the black folks, and obviously too radical for the white people. And it's just kind of like everybody just decided not to like, yeah, let's just leave that part out.
Maybe. And no, I did not see him on Brianna Joy Gray's show.
I can imagine what
that might have been an interesting. How did it go, Kenyatta?
I can imagine what she would focus on, bro. I could imagine.
I don't know. I did say I got something wrong. I misread Samantha Youssef's argument around Andor, but we're gonna get that corrected this week. When I was on Brianna's show, I misread her point about the escape, and Samantha and I, we're gonna be talking more about that this week. So, but yeah, I don't. Yeah, look, Brianna's show. I mean, because like, and apparently this is the way she does. Like, it just starts.
Yeah.
So I am kind of curious. I will have to go look. Kenyatta hasn't responded. I was trying to wait for Kenyatta to respond with the follow up on how he thought it went. But I'll have to go find out for myself. Like the old commercial said, brother, you have to get your own. You too young for that, though. I don't think you don't know nothing about that.
I think I do.
All right. Thank you, Quaker Anarchist. Tagged good guest, Prof. Absolutely. Muslim Anarchist, which was at Cornell and targeted by the propaganda during the occupation. Okay. Oh, okay. Here we go, Kenyatta. She struggled with the history just like she struggled with your knowledge. Oh, wow.
I can't imagine her not. Yeah.
I mean, look, for a lot of us, the book is revealing for those of us who are aware of the field. I don't know if she got a chance to read the book before they did the interview. But for those of us even familiar with these histories, the book is very revealing. And as he said on our interview with Renee over on Saturdays with Renee, shout out again, that he's brought all the receipts, particularly around the question that, that when he said that Harrison taught Garvey race first. I think for a lot of people, that's going to be news.
I thought Tony, what's his last name?
Tony Martin.
I thought Tony Martin said that too, though.
He did. Dr. Clark said the same thing. Like,
yeah.
Like, but I'm saying, but the amount of people who would have read or heard Tony Martin by this big 2025 is pretty small, I think.
Well, I thought all the Garveyites read Tony Martin, at least. I thought that's how they learn about Garvey, but maybe I'm wrong.
Look, I'll be fair and say that my bias suggests that, like many of us, Garveyites read Garvey and Garvey history the way Christians read the Bible.
Okay, that's fair.
So yeah, that's just, but we'll see. I mean, we'll see. I'm happy to be wrong on that one. And, but yeah, but look, this has been great. Again, salute to Dr. Ware. Appreciate all of you who made it here live. To those who will see this later, peace to you as well. Only if you're willing to fight for it. Please do like, share, subscribe, support however you think you can on our Able and Willing. And we'll catch you next time with more right here at...
And what do you sacrifice?
Calm, kindness, kinship, love. I've given up all chance at inner peace. I made my mind a sunless space. I share my dreams with ghosts. I wake up every day to an equation I wrote 15 years ago for which there's only one conclusion. I'm damned for what I do. My anger, my ego, my unwillingness to yield, my eagerness to fight, the set me on a path from which there's no escape. I yearn to be a savior against injustice without contemplating the cost, and by the time I look down, there's no longer any ground beneath my feet. What is my sacrifice? I'm condemned to use the tools of my enemy to defeat them. I burn my decency for someone else's future. I burn my life to make a sunrise that I know I'll never see. Now, the ego that started this fight will never have a mirror or an audience or the light of gratitude. So what do I sacrifice? Everything, 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 everything.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.